our prime minister, I think negligently, irresponsibly, tried to sell to the Israeli people this idea called nitzachon muchlat, or total victory. But there was never going to be a total victory. It was unfair. It wasn't right to present that, because what ended up happening was people bought into it. People believed it. People said, one second, our prime minister says, "Anachnu kepesa me'anitzachon." We are just a step away from victory. That was a year ago when he said that. More, it was 13, 14 months ago. We're nowhere near that victory that he told us we're by. And I think that what that created was this expectation that is so unrealistic, as opposed to talking straight to the Israeli people.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. This week, Israel's war against Hamas enters its 21st month, far longer, I suspect, than most people ever believed possible. Perhaps ironically, the longer the war continues, the more its goals seem elusive, and the more so many of us feel that we're in the dark without a clear idea of what is supposed to come next. Many people who have wholeheartedly supported Israel in the war are now wondering how this will ever end, and if the current government even has a plan to end it. That's certainly how I have felt recently, and in order to shed light on the situation, I was honored to welcome back Yaakov Katz, former editor of the Jerusalem Post, and author of the upcoming book While Israel Slept, where he investigates what went wrong in the lead up to October 7th, and what Israel needs to do differently so that it doesn't become complacent once again. In today's episode of the podcast, Yaakov talks about how the war is going, what the real endgame is, whether Prime Minister Netanyahu's goals for the war are achievable, what's actually happening with Israel's new system of food delivery into Gaza, and why accurate information from both the IDF and the government hasn't always been forthcoming. He also discusses how the Prime Minister's political calculations are potentially affecting war strategy, the likelihood of the Chareidi parties causing the government to collapse, the reason that Israel allows Qatar to be a mediator, the importance of international opinion, and much more. This conversation offers a thorough overview of where we are today and what we need to look for moving forward. Things change quickly every day, so you do not want to miss this deep dive into the stories behind the stories that you see in the news, both the positive and the negative. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Yaakov Katz is an Israeli-American author and journalist and a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. Between 2016 and 2023, Yaakov was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, where he continues to write a popular weekly column. Yaakov also writes a regular column for Newsweek and the Jewish Chronicle. He's the host of the JPPI Weekly Podcast and appears regularly on CNN and BBC as an analyst on Israel affairs. Yaakov is the author of 3 books: Shadow Strike, Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power, Weapon Wizards, How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower, and Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War. His next book, titled While Israel Slept, is scheduled for publication by St. Martin's Press in the fall of 2025. Prior to taking up the role of editor-in-chief, Yaakov served for 2 years as a senior policy advisor to Naftali Bennett during his tenure as Israel's Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. In 2013, Yaakov was one of 12 international fellows to spend a year at the Nyman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Originally from Chicago, Yaakov has a law degree from Bar Ilan University and lives in Jerusalem with his wife Chaya and their 4 children. Yaakov Katz, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Great to be with you.
Let's begin with the most pressing topic and the issue that I feel is the most murky. And this is a very broad question, Yaakov. What is the current status of Israel's war against Hamas in particular and the Iranian axis in general?
So we're going to be here for a couple of days, I take.
Yes, we are.
Let's start with the easier one, which is, although you know what, I'm not sure what's easier anymore, but we'll start with Gaza. The war in Gaza, for the most part, has moved into a new stage ever since what has been looked at as the intensification of the ground offensive, where the IDF is going through different parts of the Gaza Strip, in the south, in the north, in central Gaza, operating multiple divisions all throughout the Gaza Strip, basically the entire standing army of the IDF. So units that are not reserves that are serving in the military are pretty much in Gaza. And they are moving at a slow pace. They're going through what are known as Hamas areas of control to some extent, whatever that means. Hamas still in control. But it means that there are still pockets of Hamas resistance. There's still tunnel infrastructure there where Hamas has positions. We kind of got a sense of this over the weekend on Shabbat when Hamas claimed that Matan Sankauker, who is one of the hostages, they released a photo of him, very horrifying photo of him connected to an IV drip, and there are reports of his life being in danger, as every hostage who's in Hamas captivity is. But they said that Israel, which was operating in near the European hospital in Khan Yunis, where they had retrieved a body that they had taken back to Israel to see if it is if it is Muhammad Sinwar's body. Hamas then said, you're getting close to Matan, and if you do, this will lead to his death, and et cetera. Now, whether that's true or not, but I think that Israel is closing in. Israel is close to Hamas. We had the terrible tragedy of a building that capsized and 4 Israeli soldiers were killed just last week. So there's fighting. It's not as intense as it was in the beginning because Hamas is mostly broken. It doesn't have the same command and control capabilities. It doesn't have the same weapon capabilities, but it has mines, and it has booby traps, and it has anti-tank weapons, and it has snipers, and it has people who can pop out of a tunnel shaft and attack an IDF force that's moving through an alleyway. So they still exist. The recognition, though, that you need a political resolution for this war to end, I think, is settling, and that's where we start to see all this different movement now on the ground, whether it's the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, whether it's the Abu Shabab militia that Israel is apparently arming. So there is that going on. That's on Gaza. On Iran, the Americans are leading the pack. And we see the continued talks that have been taking place between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's foreign minister. More talks are expected. The Iranians have so far, what we've seen, dismissed the proposal that was put on the table by Witkoff and the Americans. At the same time, the IAEA came out with a report, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, showing that Iran has quadrupled the amount of highly enriched uranium. Well, not yet 90% military grade, but the amount that it has to 60%, which is very close to 90%. It's just a couple of days of re-enriching the uranium, that they would be at a weapons capability. That doesn't yet mean the bomb, but it means you have that key component for a bomb, which is highly enriched uranium. That just adds to the sense of urgency that this does have to be dealt with. But for the time being, it seems that Israel, without choice really in the matter, is waiting to see what will come of these talks with the Americans, even if it would have preferred to see a military option used a little more rapidly, let's say.
Okay, thank you for that overview, Yaakov. Now, I want to go back to Gaza again, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has said we need to destroy Hamas. He said that since day one, and he recently said that this goal takes precedence even over the needed return of the hostages. I'd like to know, in your opinion, what does that even mean, given that, as you just said, everyone really acknowledges that Hamas's military capability is really degraded. Right now, it's more like a guerrilla army, I think, or random terrorists without a real command structure, without real battalions. It has the ability to create havoc, but Hamas doesn't exist the same way it once existed. So my question really is, what does it even mean to destroy Hamas if that's what Bibi really intends to do?
Well, I laugh because, it's sad almost, right? Instead of crying, it's better to laugh. Let's go back for a moment if I can, Scott, because if we go back to October 7th, the success of Hamas's invasion of Israel, it wasn't just crossing into Israel, invading, breaking down IDF defense barriers and capabilities, surprising Israel the way it did. It wasn't just you could say Dayenu. If it was just the 1,200 people or so massacred, also Dayenu, and the 251 taken hostage. But altogether, what that did was it created an impossible victory, because I could have told you on October 8th that victory would mean the retrieval of the hostages, but Hamas remaining in power, and you would have told me, Yaakov, that's not a victory. And I could have told you the opposite. I could have told you, we will eliminate Hamas. We will replace it as the governing entity of Gaza. Hamas will be no more, but the hostages, we won't be able to get them back. And you would have said to me, that's also not a victory. Not you, but the proverbial you, the metaphorical you. So we were never going to be in a place that we were going to have that total victory. Now, what happened? Our prime minister, I think negligently, irresponsibly, tried to sell to the Israeli people this idea called nitzachon muchlat, or total victory. But there was never going to be a total victory. It was unfair. It wasn't right to present that, because what ended up happening was people bought into it. People believed it. People said, one second, our prime minister says, Anachnu kepesa me'anitzachon. We are just a step away from victory. That was a year ago when he said that. More, it was 13, 14 months ago. We're nowhere near that victory that he told us we're by. And I think that what that created was this expectation that is so unrealistic, as opposed to talking straight to the Israeli people, to the international community, and saying, here's what's really going to happen. We are going to degrade Hamas. We are going to weaken Hamas, destroy Hamas, eliminate as many of their people as we can. And we have to a large extent. We're going to not us create, but help facilitate and allow for the creation of this new political entity in Gaza, whether it's Egyptian, Emirati, Saudi, American, Palestinian, whatever that's going to look like, that's going to govern Gaza and is going to counter Hamas to prevent it from being able to recoup itself and rebuild. We will retain some sort of security control overall, like we do in the West Bank, where we go in when we need to. Just the other day, in Jenin, Israel went in and was able to thwart some terrorist attack that was on its way to taking place. So we know how to operate in that way. That could have been something that we would have understood, and we could have already said, oh, we're there already. And the international community would have said, oh, we understand what you're doing. We understand where you're working towards. But instead, we never did that. So where are we now? It's unclear, right? What are we doing right now? Why are we doing this? It's also unclear. Right? Is it to get back the hostages? If it's to get back the hostages, why aren't we making a deal? So the people will tell you, well, we're putting pressure on them to make a deal. Well, it's not working right now. And if it's not to make a deal and we're giving up on the hostages, then when do we reach that moment when we say, okay, we've done enough? Right? When is that moment that we've eliminated enough of Hamas? Because that also doesn't seem to be the agenda. So in absence of both of those, that's why we have people. And you see, I don't say this and I don't write this because I don't want to believe it also. We have people who say that the whole reason the war continues is because it's for the prime minister's political agenda. And I can't accept to some extent that is the full story, because it would be just beyond the pale. But there is an element of it. We can't ignore it.
Okay, well, at least from Bibi Netanyahu's perspective, from his public stance and from what he's saying, leaving aside the possible political calculations, what is he saying is actually the end game over here in a realistic way? I mean, you just said the end game's impossible. It has to be one or the other. From his perspective, at least publicly, what is the real end game? What would that even mean? That's what I'm asking.
Well, I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it could be. I think let's take if we decide that the only way we're going to get back hostages, and I think everyone knows this at this point, is going to be in a deal. Then a deal will have to be made to get back the hostages. And the question is where we are now in terms of Hamas's remaining capabilities. Is it possible to say, okay, we have gotten back the hostages, we've killed enough of Hamas, we've destroyed enough of Hamas, that now we can say, okay, after a deal, we can end the war. For that to succeed, though, and for Hamas not to rebuild itself, you need to have what is that entity on the ground that is going to govern Gaza, that is not going to be Hamas. Now, is it going to be Israel, which we know Ben Gvir and Smotrich would like to see happen? I don't think that's where Israel wants to go. So who is that going to be? Now, so far, all we see is this Abu Shabab militia, a gang of criminals and radical Islamists who Israel is arming with weapons, in my view, insane, right? But we could talk about that separately. But the reality is that you can potentially say, I've done enough militarily to be able to allow for the political resolution. It was Clausewitz who said this. I mean, this isn't one of the great Prussian military theorists of I think the 1700s, is that there is no military victory on its own. It has to be followed up with that political process. I'm not talking about two-state solution, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a new government in Gaza that will counter Hamas, prevent Hamas, stop Hamas from being in charge. By the way, the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is to some extent the beginnings of what that could be. Right now, how we went about it is so upside down that it makes you wonder, why are we doing things this way, right? Israel says, I'll take you back in time to when the war first begins. Biden comes here, says to Israel, you got to let in the aid. Israel decides to let in the aid. Then, fast forward, Israel at some point decides a couple months ago, no more aid. Smotrich says not 1 ounce of flour, right, is going into Gaza. Nothing was going in. And then suddenly we hear about the GHF. They make it seem as if it's some humanitarian foundation set up by Western Europeans. Turns out that it's Israeli. It's Israeli money. It's Israeli initiative. Why couldn't we just be honest from the beginning and say, this is what we're doing? We're doing this to bypass Hamas. It's important. It's smart. We should have actually done it a year and a half ago. Why is everything upside down? And that just, it makes me feel like we don't have a good handle on where we're going with this.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the GHF in just 1 second, but I still have one more question in terms of the end game. Meaning, if you agree, and if we all agree that Hamas cannot be in charge, so far as I know, in any potential deal, they refuse to accept that. So Hamas has said, we'll end the war and give you back the hostages, but they will not say we will go into exile and end Hamas rule of the Gaza Strip. So what choice does Bibi and the rest of the government have but to continue to give more pressure until they make that agreement? Because I think everyone will agree that a war that ends with the hostages returned, but Hamas still in charge, is to a certain extent a failure.
100%. I think that it's not a zero-sum game. Right. So it's not either Hamas is in charge or Hamas is not in charge. There's probably somewhere in the middle where Hamas will remain in some capacity. You cannot kill an idea. We cannot kill and capture and destroy every last Hamas member. We will not be able to round up every last Hamas AK-47. And we'll also probably not be able to destroy every single tunnel in the Gaza Strip. And if anyone wants any of those things to happen, then that means this is going to be the never-ending war, literally, because there just are some things that are not practically possible. But what is possible is for there to be an end to the war. Hamas might not go into exile, but you could have a force on the ground. The Emiratis have said they're willing to fund, they're willing to come in, they're willing to support. The Saudis have said that. The Egyptians, the Americans could be a part of this. The problem is different here. The problem is that it would require a Palestinian actor. And this is something that this government is refusing to accept and is refusing to even entertain. And as a result of the refusal to entertain what everyone knows is the eventual solution and is what is going to happen, it's what's going to happen. then we are playing games with ourselves because of these political constraints that exist within Netanyahu's current coalition, and we're giving weapons to the Abu Shababs, and we're doing things in a half-baked way to avoid having to deal with the political repercussions of this day after.
In other words, if I can rephrase what you're saying, it is a zero-sum game because of this particular rule which the Netanyahu government has placed on itself. There can be no Palestinian actor. Therefore, it's a zero-sum game. If they would remove that particular obstacle, rightly or wrongly, then there's room for maneuvering. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, yeah, look, the Palestinian Authority, I am no fan of them. Do not get me wrong, right? I've long been a proponent of the two-state solution. I've long written about it. I think eventually that's probably where we need to go. If you were to ask me today in a post-October 7th reality, what is the eventual solution? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it's not going to happen for 2 generations at least, right? So we can work towards something, but we're going to have to re-educate and de-radicalize and reform all of society there, definitely, and even to some extent by us. But I do think that they are the Palestinian Authority, and they are the natural candidate to potentially go into Gaza. Can they do it on their own? No. Do they have the military capability today? No. Can they be trained and supported and financed and equipped by the Americans, by the Saudis, by the Emiratis, helped by the Egyptians, et cetera, et cetera? Yes. Why does Israel not want to work with that? Because let's remember, the Netanyahu strategy has long been break apart Palestinian leadership, break apart the Palestinian people, keep them separate. So when Hamas took over Gaza in 2007 and Bibi came back to power in 2009, he had promised at the time to topple Hamas during Operation Cast Lead. When Olmert was still the prime minister, we were going into election. He came into power. He did not topple Hamas. And the opposite is true. He emboldened, strengthened Hamas. He engaged with Hamas. He allowed the Qatari money to go to Hamas. And what did he do at the same time? He demonized, delegitimized, and refused to talk to the moderate Palestinians, again, moderate in quotation marks, in Ramallah. Why? Because by keeping them separate, whenever someone would say Palestinian state, two-state solution, he would say, what are you talking about? They're divided. They don't even get along. They can't work together. What do you want me to do? Perfect answer. So he worked towards that. To do that again now, when I look at the militia in Gaza, that's what I see once again. Let's break up a centralized opportunity for Palestinian leadership in Gaza, right? We don't want to see that happen. So instead, we'll go with the Hamulot, the clans, the tribes, the gangs, right? It's a very narrow-minded, nearsighted strategy that has no chance of working, zero chance of working. It could be that what I'm suggesting also has zero chance of working. But I think, practically speaking, this is not going to work a different way.
If I understand correctly, Yaakov, it's not just that Bibi did this in 2009. Israeli governments going back into the 1980s did the same thing with Hamas that Bibi is now doing with Abu Shabab. In other words, Hamas was created on some level with Israeli backing to undermine Fatah, if I understand correctly.
So, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, because I've heard the myths of, and there's a lot of the anti-Israel, entities and people out there who want to say, well, Israel founded Hamas, right? So Israel did not found Hamas. What Israel did back in the 1970s, we all remember, at least you and I remember, the older people here, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, right? The wheelchair-bound spiritual leader of Hamas, who was eventually killed in 2003 or 2004 in a missile attack in Gaza. Ahmed Yassin was a preacher, was an educator, was a teacher. He was actually on the Israeli payroll at some point. Let's remember, after 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel controlled the Gaza Strip. And I actually went back and met with the IDF officers who were in Gaza, stationed in Gaza in the 70s and 80s, who, when Yassin came to them and applied for a license to establish an NGO called the Mujama al-Islamiyah, the Islamic Foundation, or an Islamic charity. That's what it was. And the Mujama was basically supposed to be, that's what founded, lots of people know about the Islamic University in Gaza. A lot of the bad Hamas guys came from there. Muhammad Def, Ismail Haniyeh, all these guys went there or taught there at some point. Ismail Haniyeh was the student union leader in the Islamic University. Yahya Sinwar, they all are graduates of this amazing place. And Yassin got the permission from Israel to establish this. Okay. Over the years, what Israel began to see is that this Islamic movement was actually being a counterweight to who we saw as the primary enemy at the time, which were the secularists, the Fatah guys, who were the ones who, remember, Black September, hijacking airplanes, carrying out shooting attacks at Lod Ben Gurion Airport, you name it, all throughout the 70s and the 80s. And Israel looked at that and said, okay, this is good that we have them fighting with one another. So it came to a point that in the mid-'80s, we caught weapons by the followers of the Mujama. Yassin himself was put into prison, but for a very short time. And it was basically, we said to ourselves, you know what? It's not a problem for us. It's a problem for the Palestinians. So let them fight each other. Now, this morphed into something bigger. It's very easy for us to sit here today and say, you know, would have, should have, could have. But knowing that history, knowing the piece of history of what happened in Lebanon, which is another example, right, with the Falangot, right, and the militias and the Christian militias that we also supported during the first Lebanon War, and then eventually what came out of Sabra and Shatila and other places over the years. The Americans did these same mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not a strategy. In the absence of something else, maybe right now it's the best that we can do. I don't know, but I don't think so. I think that we could do more. I think a different government would be capable of doing more. And for this to be what Israel is doing, to the thought that we are actively giving weapons to people who hate us, because today the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I'm sorry, is really stupid. If that's what this war was all about, to end like this, to go to something like this, it really shows something we're lost with this government.
Let me just make one thing clear. I agree with you. I wasn't saying that Israel founded Hamas. I do mean they
No,
tacitly supported them in its fight against Fatah.
Correct.
That's what I meant by that. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, because there have been all sorts of reports back and forth that tens of civilians have been shot. Hamas is claiming last week, every day, this day 31, this day 20, this day however many. Israel says it's entirely false. Do we know what's really going on there, what's true and what isn't?
You know, I mean, the GHF, again, as an idea, is a good idea. When we allowed in all this humanitarian aid in the beginning, there was clear evidence of Hamas hijacking it, Hamas grabbing it, reselling it, using it for itself, sustaining itself. The mere idea that also in the immediate aftermath of October 7, the worst massacre of Jews on a single day since the Holocaust, the kidnapping and abduction of 251 people, the sexual crimes, the way people were murdered in the most horrific ways. And then the world comes to us and says, give them gas, give them fuel, give them food, give them water. You know, I remember thinking at the time, I said this in a number of places also, is that can we imagine after 9/11, when bin Laden was believed to be in the Tora Bora Mountains on the Pakistani-Afghani border, and America comes in and bombs the hell out of those mountain complexes, thinking that they might get bin Laden, and someone were to come to George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and say at the time, hey, stop. You got to give them gas and fuel for their generators so they can have air in their cave complexes. Does anyone really think that George W. Bush would have said, sure, I'll stop my war? I mean, of course not. Why were we expected to be differently? So the whole lopsidedness of this is just so absurd to begin with. But we can't ignore the fact that there are 2 million citizens in Gaza for the most part. And these are people who need food, who there is a humanitarian crisis that has been brewing there for a while. Is there starvation? I do not know exactly. But there's a tragedy that's unfolded in Gaza. And the more that the civilians have to be able to sustain themselves, that could offset the pressure. And that was always going to be the balance. But the idea that we give it, and not through the UN, and not through the World Food Program, and not through other institutions, so it can be done in a way that it bypasses the Hamas structure, was a good idea, and it should have been done a long time ago. So that itself is good. The problem here is that, again, like I said, how we established it, why we did it that way. You've seen already 3 leaders of the GHF who have been. There was one, there was another. He quit, then another guy quit. Now there's a Reverend Johnny Moore, who's a known evangelical leader who was appointed just last week to be the head of the GHF. He's a known pro-Israel advocate, very right-wing, conservative in America, appointed by Trump to a number of different uh, panels and committees in the administration. Why do I mention Johnny Moore? Because, like you said, last Sunday, there was a report that Israel had opened fire and massacred 35 dozens of Palestinians who were trying to get food. And we all saw how Naftali Bennett went on and made a video and pushed back, but the IDF was nowhere to be found. And only just a couple hours before the Shavuot holiday began on Sunday night did the IDF spokesperson finally put out a statement and say this was not true. Johnny Moore actually said the other day in an interview with ABC News, so I take his word at it as the head of GHF, that there have been cases that Israel has killed people who were in the vicinity of these compounds where they're giving out the food. But to your question, so sorry for the long-winded answer, but to your question, it's difficult to know because the IDF is not exactly telling us. And why are they not exactly telling us? I don't know the full answer, and I am concerned and a little disturbed by the lack of information and transparency right now on this issue.
Okay, let me ask you about a lack of transparency in other places, because one of my own personal complaints against the current government is the paucity of information that the prime minister and others are providing. But I'm not a security or military expert, so perhaps I'm expecting too much. Let me ask you, do you think that there is not enough information moving forward? In other words, to me, part of the problem is when people say the war should or should not end, we don't know enough information because they're not providing it. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, they're not providing. Now, part of that is the fog of war. Part of that is you don't want is information security. You don't want to necessarily reveal too much because the enemy is, of course, always watching. But part of it is also you don't want to tell the full story. We spoke about this just before, right? What is the outcome? What is the goal? What's the objective of this war? We also don't know, right? We're told the elimination of Hamas. Okay, when? Where? How do we know when we've hit that point? Is it 70% of Hamas gone? Is it 80% of Hamas gone? Maybe we've already reached that. Is it 90% of Hamas? Maybe we've already hit these numbers and it's possible to call it a day. So, excuse me, what is the purpose right now of this conflict? I'll tell you something else. The Israeli media is very patriotic for the most part, very critical of Netanyahu, that's true, but very patriotic when it comes to the military, when it comes to security issues. For the vast majority of this war, I would say almost 18 months, you saw barely any reportage in the Israeli media about the tragedy in the Gaza Strip. And by the way, I have no problem saying tragedy. People sometimes say, how could you dare say that there's a tragedy? No, there is a tragedy, right? There are tens of thousands of people who have been killed. There are many civilians dead. Gaza is leveled, but I put the blame on Hamas. I think they are responsible, but I can recognize inside me that there is a tragedy in Gaza. The Israeli media has barely reported on it. In the last month or so, suddenly that's changed. Why? Suddenly that has changed. I think the reason is because the sentiment in Israel has changed. And the Israeli media picks up on the sentiment and understands people are starting to ask, why are we still in Gaza? What are we still fighting for? And that is what's led now, even in the media, for them to start to write about and talk about and report on what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip. So it's a, can the government give us more information? 100%. But this falls into the fact that the government doesn't want to commit itself to anything, doesn't want to tie itself down.
Speaking about what's going on there and the possibility of ending the war, I have heard numerous people, perhaps they're not informed, but they have said if the war ends now with a deal, basically Hamas wins, and in 5 years we will be back to where we were on October 6th. Speaking as a layperson without any inside knowledge, to me that's absurd, because it doesn't mean, oh, the war's over, now we completely disengage. First of all, it took Hamas 15 or 20 years to build up what they had on October 7th. It's not as though in 5 years they can redo it, especially with Israel now watching them very differently than in the past. I'm not suggesting the war should simply end, but to me, the idea that if the war ends in 5 years, Hamas will be just as strong as it is or was a year and a half ago is absurd. Am I right or wrong?
Look, you're right in the sense that if the war ends and Hamas is able to be unchecked and to rebuild and then it will go back to what it was. I mean, there's no doubt.
But that's not going to happen. No one thinks that's going to happen.
There's a number of things that have to happen for that not to happen. The first thing that has to happen is we need a new governing entity in Gaza. Who is that? We spoke about who the possible candidates could be, from Israel to the Palestinians to these gangs. The other thing that needs to happen is Israel will have to incorporate or adopt a new defensive or offensive posture vis-a-vis Gaza. So there are two options that are kind of the same. One is we look at Gaza like we look at the West Bank. So we work according to intelligence. Israel does not sit in Jenin, does not sit in Ramallah, does not sit in Nablus. It's all over the place outside. But if and when needed, it goes into Jenin, it goes into Nablus, goes into Ramallah, and picks up whatever it is that it's working according to. Gaza is a little different, so that might not work necessarily because it is some of these places are also very densely populated, but there's a lot more going on in Gaza than in the West Bank. But you also have a preemptive strike doctrine that I think Israel will have to adopt. And we see that we are continuing with that in Lebanon. We saw just last week when Israel announced the war in Lebanon is supposedly over. And Israel announced suddenly in this area, in the Dachia neighborhood of Beirut, with the known Hezbollah stronghold neighborhood, leave these streets, leave these homes. We have intelligence of UAV drone production in these buildings. We're going to bomb, and Israel bombed, right? Those are things that Israel never did before. Until October 7th, all Israeli governments, consecutive Israeli governments, never adopted a preemptive military strike doctrine or policy when it comes to conventional military buildup. We did it in only two instances. One for nuclear. So that was the Osirak reactor in 1981, the Al-Kibar reactor in Syria in 2007. But nuclear was its own category, so their preemption was okay. And in the aftermath of the civil war in Syria, we did what we called the war between wars. So because we knew that Assad was not capable of retaliating against us, we felt confident enough to bomb and attack Iranian entrenchment in Syria. We never did it in Lebanon, and we never did it in Gaza. Why? Because the whole theory in Israel always was, we don't start a war because of a conventional military buildup. So we would see Hezbollah smuggle in and reach 150,000 rockets and missiles. We would see Hamas dig tunnels, build capabilities, train out in the open, and we did nothing. Now that has to change now. I think we all recognize that. That has to be a huge pillar of change for the Israeli military. By the way, it's a massive change for the Israeli people, because what it ultimately means is that we're going to be engaged in conflict for a long time, right? It means that you're going to have to constantly and consistently fight. And that's something that's difficult to accept and come to terms with, because what I often think about is, and I wonder if you agree with me, what do Israelis really want at the end of the day, down to our core being? Just to live a good life.
Leave us alone.
Leave us alone. Exactly. And lots of people think
it's very funny because most anti-Zionists, I'll say across the globe, think that Israel's endgame is to take over the entire Middle East.
No, we're like colonialists. We want to take over everywhere.
We just want everyone to leave us alone. Just
exactly.
Let us be.
Let us be. And I mean, let us be even in small borders. We would take it. I mean, that's how crazy it all is. So if Israelis go back, if we now have quiet in the north, quiet in the south, and then the real challenge will be kids are on vacation, the summer's coming up. And the tzimmers, those, that's the tzimri mileim, the hotels and the Airbnbs in the north are all full, and people are hiking and traveling and enjoying vacation. Then suddenly the prime minister gets intelligence, Hezbollah is moving a rocket, or Hamas is digging a tunnel. Do you attack and risk a war again, another round? Or do you say, you know what, let's add it to the board. We'll remember where it is. But we got the school year starting. We don't want to ruin people's vacations. It's a real dilemma. And I don't know what we'll do. It's easy to answer that now. I don't know what we'll do in a couple months from now. And I think that is the fundamental change that will have to take place here.
I think Hamas also realizes that that is the Israeli dilemma in some of those hostage return ceremonies they gave and the various other small breaks of the ceasefire from January to March. When we'd see them doing small things, it was almost like, will Israel actually break the ceasefire because of this one thing? And I think that's an ongoing question which Israel has to always answer for itself, and which the other guys are always wondering how far they can push before Israel actually will retaliate.
People forget, but you'll remember this. Before October 7th, for a couple of years but before that, they were doing the incendiary kites and balloons and flying them over the border, and we didn't do anything. They were protesting months ahead of October 7th along the border. And we saw it, and Bibi even convened a security cabinet meeting and some consultations, but the answer to it was pretty much, there's nothing that we really need to do. It's just more of the same.
Is this worth a war?
Yeah, and it's not worth doing anything. And that was just, it was so entrenched, that preference of quiet for just a little longer. Let's not break it. Another round of violence will come. It always happens. It's the nature of this region. So, if you look back from when Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005 up until October 7th, we fought the Summer Rains operation in 2006, Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, Pillar of Defense in 2012, Protective Edge in 2014, 2018 had another Black Belt operation, then a couple of days, then you had Guardian of the Walls, then you had Dawn, Twilight. I mean, all these different crazy names that we came up. But it was like every 2 years on average, you had something. I mean, it was kind of like just the accepted reality.
Well, it was called mowing the lawn.
And it's called mowing the lawn. And it was also called, okay, we'll clash, we'll hit them, they'll hit us, and then we'll just go back to the way things were, right? But there was never let's go all the way. There was never let's take it all out. Even, I mean, you go back in time. It's very disturbing to think about it. But you go back to 2014. Protective Edge was the longest. It was a war essentially, but it was the longest operation, longer than the Yom Kippur War, 51 days. That was the first time that Hamas started to pop out of tunnels inside Israel. They did it once when they kidnapped Gilad Shalit in 2006. But then during that war, they were popping out of tunnels. They were raiding IDF military posts, and soldiers were killed as a result. Bibi didn't want to go in on the ground. In the end, he was forced to, but only to eliminate the tunnels along the border. Israel's whole focus on tunnels was tunnels along the border, the ones that crossed into Israel. The network of hundreds of miles of tunnels inside Gaza, we never gathered intelligence about. We didn't care about, for a very simple reason. We looked at them as if that's their bunker for the event that there's a war. We'll try to see where they're going, and if needed, we'll bomb them. But we never in our wildest dreams imagined that we would have 251 people being held inside tunnels. And when the war broke out and this happened, we were clueless to begin to find. And that's how we've reached a situation that just recently the IDF admitted that maybe at best they've eliminated 50% of Hamas's tunnels. We're almost 2 years into this war.
One of the things, and I realize this isn't our topic, but I'll mention it anyway, one of the areas which I believe has gotten very little attention, even though it deserves to be seen with a little bit more of a cynical eye, is that after each one of those instances of mowing the lawn, I remember that the IDF or the government would make statements, oh, we sent Hamas back 4 years, or this is a major, we took care of 50% of their whatever. And I kind of knew at the time that it was a lie, because it was ridiculous. But now we know for sure that there's no way they believe that. They were just feeding us a bill of goods. And when we talk about they're not providing real information, we see for the past 20 years, they've been feeding us what we want to hear rather than what's actually happening.
You know why I smile? Because you touch a raw nerve by me. Because I'll make it personal. I covered the IDF as a military reporter for just over 10 years. And I was editor of the Jerusalem Post up until 2023, into 2023, and just stepped down just before the war. I was at all those briefings with the IDF head of military intelligence, with the chiefs of staff, over consecutive year, over 2 decades, pretty much. And I bought that narrative too, as did everyone else in the Israeli media. There has to be, by the way, I've written about this, there has to be a din v'cheshbon of like accountability of the Israeli media, because we were partners to this great cover up to an extent. We bought hook, line, and sinker, as the term goes. I think that we bought the narrative that Hamas was deterred. I would sit in briefings with the chief of staff, with other editors, the best, most accomplished journalists in our country, and they would give for 2 hours with graphs and classified videos and what have you, and tell us stories about Iran and Hezbollah, and then barely touch on Hamas, barely. And then someone would say, "What about Hamas?" And no, they're deterred. I'm exaggerating, but it was pretty much like that. And we just said, "Oh, Hamas is deterred." No one ever pushed back on it. No one. And that's how we got to this situation to some extent. No one was challenging those people you mentioned. After Guardian of the Walls operation, Shomer Chomot in 2021, the head of the operations director at the time was General Aaron Khaliva, who just afterwards, that operation became appointed the head of Amman, the head of military intelligence. He said publicly after Guardian of the Walls that in his estimate, Hamas is now deterred for 5 years. 5 years. 2 years later, they invaded Israel with October 7th. 2 years later. Where did 5 years go? It was all nonsense. It was nonsense. And it came from this fairy tale that we believed in, unfortunately, and we were all complicit, I think.
And I'm not sure which is worse, if it's nonsense and they actually believed it themselves in the army, or if it's nonsense that they were feeding us, realizing it was nonsense. Both of them are indictments.
Yes, they are. They're both bad options.
I'm going to stay with the war, but I'm going to go into a different topic and get back to the war, because I want to ask about the current government, because over the past week, there has been very serious talk that the Chareidi parties, namely Shas and Gimel, are going to pull out and make the government fall. This is because the government has not yet passed a bill exempting yeshiva students from military service. Could you explain a little more, just as much as you know, what is actually going on over there? Why are the Charedim not accepting the bill that Edelstein, who's in Likud, who's in charge of drafting this bill, is trying to put together? What's wrong with the bill from their perspective?
Well, I mean, at the core is, and I think you probably know more about this than I do, but at the core, I identify it as a fear of losing control, and as a fear of losing the rabbinic leadership and the political leadership losing their control over their flock. But what are they really against here in the details of it? They don't want their people drafting into the army. And even if they recognize that some will have to draft, they don't want any sanctions. The sanctions is the big issue right now. Now, my wife asked me the other day, what is the percentage of chilonim, of secular Israelis, who we have the term in Hebrew, mishtamtim, right, are draft dodgers? And I said, it doesn't exist. In other words, there's a tiny percentage of like conscientious objectors. You have maybe on two hands, we can count them. You have people who, yes, they don't want to serve. They go get a mental health exemption. They have a physical health impairment, whatever it is. So there's about 20%, 25% of people who don't serve in the army because of exemptions. But you, as a secular Israeli or a national religious Israeli, you can't just sit at home and not go to the army. It doesn't exist, right? And if you don't, they come and arrest you, right? If you ignore your call-up orders, you will be arrested. The Charedim are different, right? So there are sanctions for people like me, people like you. If we don't go, this is what happens. And our children. The Charedim, they don't get call-up orders, and they have the exemption. So they of course, they have to declare that they're in yeshiva, and they have to stay in yeshiva for a period of time. They're supposed to be there. But out of the 80,000, most of them are not apparently in yeshiva. But they automatically get that exemption, and they don't get the call-up orders, and therefore there are no sanctions. So what Edelstein's law has basically come ahead and said is we are going to set quotas, we're going to set draft numbers, and it's going to be gradual anyhow, because the IDF wouldn't be able to get all these people all at once. But there will be sanctions for those who don't come. And that's something that they're kind of hanging, that's the hill they're dying on right now.
It's the sanctions.
It's the sanctions. But really at the end of the day is they don't want to have their people drafted. And I think it really comes from the fact that they recognize, you see, I'm sure you talk to Charedim like I do. They have real concerns, and we can't just, erase them and ignore them. When I think about my children going to the army, I'm worried about them dying in the army, to be honest. That is my main concern. When a Chareidi, I think mother or father thinks about their child going to the army, what they're concerned about is their kid coming back not Chareidi, right? And that's a legitimate concern. In my worldview, for what it's worth, there are more bigger concerns like this continued existence of the state of Israel and how we need soldiers. But that is a legitimate concern, and we have to deal with that, right? We can't just ignore it. But I think that concern does show that it's, for the rabbis at least, and for the political leadership, they understand that people who will go to the army will be exposed. They will lose exposed to the world, right? They'll be, and they already are, but to an even more greater extent. Even in the Chareidi units, even, Hashmonaim, this new brigade, the Hasmonean brigade, it's to be an officer or commander in the brigade, you have to be a halachic observant Jew, right? So it's not only male, right? That's given. You have to wear a kippah. You have to be somebody who is a from observant, the Orthodox Conundrum, an Orthodox Jew. That is an attempt by the army to ease some of those concerns. But I think that, what pains me about this whole issue is that we are in a real deep, the division in Israel is really huge right now. And I just feel like the Haredim once again are showing this, that Israel's we're not part of Israel. We don't care enough about the country. We're here. In other words, the whole perspective of the state is as if it's just a tool and a vehicle to let them live their life. It's a very diaspora, shtetl-like approach and attitude. The state just funds us, but that's how it is. It's like, taking money from the state of New York for schools in Kiryas Joel, where the Satmars are. It's the same kind of attitude. No, people are here because they believe in this place. They sacrifice themselves for this place. And the fact that in the same week that 6 soldiers were killed in Gaza, the Haredi politicians are sitting there huffing and puffing about how they're not going to let their people serve when we don't have soldiers. It's mind-blowing to me.
Okay, in that case, how likely do you think that it is that the government actually will fall over this issue in the next few weeks?
Well, I'll voice a personal hope, which is I hope it does fall.
Me too.
Because I think this government is no good, and I think that this is an issue that it should fall on. I think it's crazy that the government that was in office and was there on October 7th is still in office as well, after the failures and the disasters that came. But this is an issue that really strikes it talks about the future of the state of Israel. I'm not sure it will fall. It could still happen. I think that Netanyahu, I don't identify the pressure that when he's under pressure, he's under pressure. I don't see it yet. It might be there, but I just don't see it. The Haredim are making noise that they're going to bring a vote on Wednesday to disperse the Knesset. Just to explain to our listeners, it's not enough to pull out of the coalition. You have to then vote to disperse the Knesset. So it's a law, essentially, which would require of the Haredim to vote with the opposition, of course. And I don't yet know. So they could pull out of the coalition, but not vote. And then it wouldn't pass. They could pull out and vote, or they could not pull out at all, and this could just drag on. Netanyahu's objective is not crazy. What he wants to reach is middle of July, so it's just about 6 weeks away, when the Knesset will go on summer break, the summer recess. There'll be the end of the summer session of the Knesset. If he can get there, then even if they wanted to bring a vote to disperse the Knesset, there's no Knesset. So then that vote would be delayed until when the Knesset resumes, which is after the Jewish holidays. So after Sukkot, which is after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's well into October, which means he's good now for 3 months. If he can make it till mid-July, he'll be good for another 3 months. And then when the election would be called, it would be held sometime in January or February. I think that's more likely at the moment. But, I've learned in this business, be careful not to make predictions about Israeli politics.
Then let me ask you a question that if the government does fall, whether now, whether in October or any other time, would that actually, getting back to the war, provide an opportunity? Because it would seem to me, based on everything you've said until now, Yaakov, that not making a deal for Bibi vis-a-vis Hamas, etc., is largely because of his right flank and the need to hold Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in the coalition. Well, once the coalition is dispersed, he might want to present himself as the guy who made the deal, who stood up to the Charedim, so to speak, and who didn't kowtow to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So my question is, if the government falls, does that actually give, in addition to the possibility of electing a different government, a possibility and an impetus to making a deal quicker?
So let me break it down. But let me also talk about the Charedim for a moment, because this also ties in. If he knows the government's going to fall and the Charedim are pulling out, why not pass the law that would, before the Knesset vote on dispersion? Because once the Knesset is dispersed, you can't pass laws. But why not pass the law already? Come out looking like, yes, I changed reality. I got them in. They were going to pull out anyhow, but I forced them out because I passed the right law for the country. The opposition would vote with him. Why not do the right thing? And I think that he could, but he won't, because he wants to hold off for the prospect that they'll come back in a future government. Now, we could say the same thing about the war. If the government falls and we go to an election, there's part that could say, 1 second, make the deal, end the war, bring home the hostages, call it a day. Anyhow, the government fell. And then go to the election as the guy who brought back the hostages. But then there's the other side, which is, 1 second, maybe it's politically better to go to an election with the war still going on. So then I, being Netanyahu, can make the contrast between me and who might come on the center left all the more clearer of what so I will be able to say is, Bibi, I am committed to defeating them. I am committed to total victory. Yair Golan, Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, they will bring Hamas back. That could work with voters here. So I'm not sure which way he would go. I could see both cases. And with Netanyahu, it's always difficult to know exactly.
Let me ask one more question about that. There has been a contention put out by people, perhaps in the government and certainly outside of the government, who are supporters of Bibi, to say that you cannot make a government fall during a war. That's irresponsible. It will hamper the war effort. Is there any truth to that contention?
Well, there are people who are genuinely concerned, and Bibi has refused to answer the question. There was a press conference that he had just a couple weeks ago, first one in a long time, where he was asked, what are you going to do if there's an election during the war? This would be this is uncharted waters and territory, I think, for Israel. We've never had such a scenario before. I don't know what would happen. And I'd be concerned that the war could be used as an excuse to do things that might be undemocratic.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, call off a vote, say that in certain areas of Israel, you can't vote right now. We can't have ballot boxes in areas that are near war zones, that are under rocket threats. I don't know, right? Or say we can't actually hold an election and we're going to pass a law that's going to prevent the vote during. There are things that can be done. Now, there's going to be major pushback to that in this country. But I've long been a proponent of let governments govern. But if steps were to be taken in that direction, that's already something a little different.
On May 14th, the Free Press published an expose by Franny Block and Jay Solomon entitled How Qatar Bought America. It's riveting and it's troubling, and I recommend the listeners read that article. It clearly demonstrates that Qatar is, for lack of a better term, both the cop and the prostitute in this war. They are doing so many things to undermine Israel and to gain the West's attention and to basically go under the radar as an American ally who's actually funding Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. My question isn't really about the United States, though. My question is that Israel has accepted Qatar as one of the, or perhaps the main mediator with Hamas. Again, Qatar funds Hamas. They are together with Hamas. They are on Hamas's side, so to speak. They don't recognize Israel's existence. How is it that this government and all governments in Israel accept Qatar as a mediator, as opposed to saying, we will not accept this, we want a mediator who is not in bed with Hamas?
Israel, I think, came into this with its hands tied. It was the Qataris stepped up very quickly. They had the access because they host Hamas leadership in Qatar. They fund Hamas. And they had funded Hamas over a period of years, also per the request of Israel. But Israel, to some extent, has had a very complex and complicated relationship with the Qataris throughout history. There were some trade relations. There was a trade office that famously was opened there after the Oslo Accords. Rabin had visited there. Peres had visited there. The reality was such that Israel, maybe with the Biden administration's push, but also to some extent on its own, decided to prefer the Qatari mediation because it saw some results early on, right? The Qataris were able to get back two of the American Israeli hostages very early on. They were from the Chicago area. I forget their names at the moment, Natalie something and her daughter, just a couple weeks into the war. And then there was that initial ceasefire that saw the release of about 100 of the hostages, and the women and the children. So Qatar was able to prove itself. I think that throughout the war, what we've seen is this a bit of a tug of war of its own, of how much pressure should be placed on Qatar. How much should Qatar be exposed for the evil role that it does play? And it does play that. And Israel has been in a bind. And today, there is a lot of politics that are involved in this. There's the investigation against the prime minister's inner circle called Qatargate, who some of his advisors apparently were on the payroll or working also for the Qataris. The Qataris were also working. You know, the tentacles that went into the American academia and cultural and sports and arts, etc., to some extent was also taking place here, it seems. And former generals and former Mossad guys and advisors who also worked for the prime minister at the same time were also doing projects for the Qataris. They were smart in what they do. This is the MO of the Qataris, to use their money to buy leverage, access, and influence. And Israel, let's be honest, was caught with its pants down and was caught off guard and didn't really have a way to deal with the Qataris effectively.
Well, what about that Qatargate scandal, which frankly, over the past month seems to have died down a little bit. We don't hear about it so much. To me, it's at least potentially something that's truly massive. The idea that people in the prime minister's office were in the pockets of Qatar financially. To me, the fact that that isn't the biggest news story in the world for Israelis is a little bit surprising that people aren't making noise about this.
I mean, because it really comes down to, first of all, what exactly were they doing? Who was paying them? What they were being paid for? And what was their status within the prime minister's office? And there's a bigger problem here that I feel like it should be the main story, which is why are people allowed to serve as external contractors and advisors to the prime minister? Which means at the same time that I'm advising you, I can advise this guy and that guy. One of those guys happened to be the Qataris potentially, or someone working on behalf of the Qataris. That's a bigger problem that should be exposed. To think that Netanyahu might have known about this, I don't know. To think that he took money, God forbid, I doubt that was the case. But clearly there's some conflict of interest here that does have to be thoroughly probed and investigated.
Okay. How important, Yaakov, is international public opinion? It seems that Israel has never been good at Hasbara. Israel has never been or had the upper hand ever since maybe a week into the war. But now, even the countries that were supporting Israel seem to be wavering. Germany, France, Great Britain, the Western European nations that Israel generally counts on to support it to some degree, are saying that we're going to put sanctions on Israel. Should Israel be worried about international public opinion, and should that affect the way they prosecute the war moving forward?
Of course. I mean, without a doubt, right? We are highly dependent on the international community. We're definitely dependent on the United States. I mean, look, my little toys here behind me, these airplanes I've gotten over the years from these are like model airplanes to those who are just listening and not watching. The F-35, the Apache, the F-15. They are American-made military platforms. If we don't get along with America and America decides not to send us spare parts, we won't be able to fly. I mean, it's that simple. The Germans support. We buy our submarines from them. The world. We have trade with the European Union. If we are sanctioned in a way, they're our greatest trade partner. If they sanction us, if they boycott Israeli goods, if they say no more selling to Israel, no more buying from Israel, no more travel, no more tourists from Israel, where this could go, it's not unimaginable. All this happened to countries in the past. It's happened to South Africa. It's happened to Venezuela. It's happened to North Korea. It's happened to Russia as we speak. It's happening to Russia. Do we want to be? Now, of course, we're not in the same boat. I believe we are just and legitimate in our war, but we can't ignore that this is a reality. Now, is it because they're fools and they're stupid and they're against us? I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that they're all against us. They're not all anti-Semites. They're not all stupid. Are they looking at the war the way you and I do? No. Did they give Israel a great deal of support in the beginning? Yes. Did we quickly exhaust that credit? Also, yes. Could we have done things a little differently? I spoke about this before. I think that we could have outlined and articulated a plan that would have made sense to the world. But now no one understands what we're doing. So they look at Gaza and they say Israel's just killing people to kill. Israel's destroying just for the sake of destruction. We have to tell a different story. And we can't ignore, the fact that we're bad at Hasbara, that's a given. But we need to explain something. We need to tell some story to the world, and we're not even doing that. And I'm afraid, the French are already saying we're going to recognize the Palestinian state. Germany, which has historic ties with us for bad reasons, but has long stood by us, is already wavering. There's daylight now that you can't ignore between us and the Trump administration. We're not in a good place. And the thought that this can just go on, the problem, I think, to some extent, is that Israelis buy, it's very easy to sell to an Israeli. They're just all anti-Semites, right? And Israelis kind of buy into that. Israelis look at things as like it's either 1 or 0. They're either with us or they're against us. Biden, remember when Biden came here just 2 weeks into the war? He was our savior. Bibi literally, go back and watch the video, literally fell into his arms at Ben Gurion Airport. Every Israeli loved Biden. Saba Joe, they called him, right? A few months later, he's asking questions about Rafah. He's asking questions about the use of 1-ton bombs. He's an anti-Semite, right? Donald Trump, he's coming. He's gonna save us. He's gonna let us do whatever we want. He comes into office, removes all the sanctions from the Israeli settlers that the Biden administration had put on. It's no holds bar. No, we'll be able to do whatever we want. Suddenly he comes to the region. He doesn't come here. He says he wants the Gaza war over. He talks about starvation in Gaza. He's making deals with the Iranians. He's talking directly with Hamas. He's making deals with the Houthis to end their attacks on ships, but not their attacks on Israel. So what happened to Trump? Again, it's just not that way. Every president has their own interests. Europe has their issues to deal with. So I love when people say to me, Macron, he's afraid of the North African migrants in Paris, the ones who are looting and burning parts of Paris. And if that's so what? What does that mean? So what? So okay, so fine. So that's the case. But he's making decisions that are impacting us. Right. So for whatever reason it is, why does that make a difference to us? So I'm glad that we're able to rationalize and get into Macron's head. But the fact of the matter is we have lost Emmanuel Macron. We've lost the Spanish a long time ago. The British were losing and lost. And the Germans are going. This is not Canada. The Australians. It's not a good place.
Okay, Yaakov, before we conclude, I want to ask you about your new book that's coming out, I believe, on September 2nd, While Israel Slept, which is, I think, your investigation of how October 7th happened. Tell me about the book.
While Israel Slept, which I co-authored with Amir Buchbut, who's a good friend of mine, and we wrote another book together called Weapon Wizards a few years ago. He's the military analyst for Walla News, one of the big Israeli Hebrew websites, really looks at what transpired in the 48 hours before October 7th and what led to that very clear disaster that morning. and the breakdown of intelligence and operational capabilities and everything across the board, but then also looks back and goes back in time and looks at what we spoke about earlier, the founding of Hamas, where it came from, the signs that were all there along the way, to the funding of Hamas, from the founding to the funding, to the different missed opportunities to eliminate Hamas leadership over the years, to the decisions that some were good and some were bad by different prime ministers, from Netanyahu to Bennett to Lapid and others. Where did we go wrong, and how did we fall into this state of complacency? And that's what the book tries to look into and tries to come up with an answer. And it's not easy. There's no one answer. And really what troubled us, I think, the most was looking to the future. Because of what you and I spoke about, what do Israelis want? We want to live in peace and quiet, is we could fall back into that state of complacency very quickly. And how do we avoid that? And I think that's the real challenge right now, is how to not go back into that to fall back into that trap. So we also outline at the end of the book a number of recommendations to not fall into that. So whether it's intelligence reforms of the structural reforms within the intelligence community, to different ways of building up independence in our defense production, our ties with the Americans, our Hasbara capabilities that we need to do more about, but looking at also practical solutions and practical recommendations, and also talking about, I think, what is maybe the greatest sin of this government, which is they took us on that path of division. And what we saw was how when we are weak internally, our enemies take advantage of it. So it's a deep inspection of what went wrong in the days before, in the years prior, and also looking to the future of how we can avoid that from happening.
And is that book available for pre-order?
The book is definitely pre-order away.
Okay. We'll put a link in the show notes. It sounds very, very good, even if it's troubling at the same time. Yaakov, I always appreciate speaking with you. I always learn a lot. I'm sure everybody listening learned a lot. And I thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.